My name is James Robson, and I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center. I'd like to welcome you to the Asia Center's Research Talk series, which is part of a new series of virtual programming at the Asia Center. The research talks are aimed at showcasing some of the fascinating research that's being done on various facets of Asia by Harvard students, graduate students, faculty, Asia Center affiliates, and other specialists. We very much hope you enjoyed learning from these talks.
Hi, my name is Kaitlin Hao, and I am a rising senior in the History of Art and Architecture department at Harvard University. Today, in this presentation, I will be reflecting upon a research project I conducted this past January in Hong Kong through a research grant provided by the Harvard University Asia Center. In my initial research plan, I hoped to investigate the effects of urban space on the practice of contemporary artists working in the region. But what I didn't realize is that my original research plan contained many misconceptions about Hong Kong. So first, I will explain the assumptions that I brought into my research, and then explain how 5 artists, Ferenc Lai, Lam Tung Pang, Ma Chi-hung, Zheng Bo, and Pak Chuen helps me understand that there are numerous ways to define and study space and urban living in Hong Kong. These are certainly not all the artists and scholars that I met on this trip, but they did help illustrate the 2 main points that I want to make in this presentation. The first is that lack of physical space is not always a limitation for art making. And second, using lack of physical space to study Hong Kong overlooks the diversity within the region itself. So when first formulating my research, I wanted to find a topic that complicates Hong Kong's common portrayal as this sort of portal that connects China and the rest of the world. I wanted a topic that captured the cultural agency of Hong Kong, so I began to research the unique challenges and circumstances that illustrate the Hong Kong story. I came across space and urban living, which is already a very popular topic for Western researchers studying Hong Kong. You see all these news media outlets who sensationalize how little space is afforded to the working class people. I also thought that space would be an effective metaphor to explain the anxiety regarding the continuous encroachment of the mainland Chinese government upon the region. And lack of space certainly influenced the development of the art scene in Hong Kong, as many of the foremost galleries or art organizations started in abandoned buildings. And there's also this very strong history of temporary installation art in the region itself. But what I didn't realize is that to focus on the limitations of artistic practice does not adequately acknowledge the flexibility and creativity of working artists. Especially for artists, the urban metropolis is not a limitation, but an ecology in which to play and explore. And space is also this very fluid term that must be redefined for every single artist, which made it really difficult to keep it at the center of whatever conversation we were having. This can also be attributed to the time in which I visited Hong Kong, which made it quite awkward to discuss something so secondary to perception. Why should we discuss conditions that shape events when violent acts and chaos were still happening on the streets when I was there? In January, Hong Kong was experiencing their first extended lull in the 2019 extradition protests that had been raging for the past half year. My meetings with artists were sort of the first opportunity for them to reflect on the protests themselves and what Hong Kongers were truly fighting for. I was completely astounded at the generosity and vulnerability that these artists shared with me during such an uncertain time. And one artist described to me that being in the protests was like being at war, which really captures how many Hong Kongers are feeling at the moment. That these laws with very subtle language that are being passed and these freedoms that Hong Kongers feel like are being taken away feel like a choice between life and death. So it was certainly a challenge for me to figure out how space fits into this kind of climate. Ferenc Lai is an artist who integrates discussion of politics and space and explicates this idea that everyone defines space differently really well. Lai defines space as rooted within the human body's sensory perception and its interactions with the environment, where the threshold of the body is subjective and culturally relative. Lai told me this personal anecdote that really helped me understand this. One time, when she was in mainland China on a crowded bus, a woman held on to Lai's arm instead of a handle to steady herself. And this was shocking to Lai as a Hong Konger, where people have a more strict threshold of personal space. What she might have perceived as a transgression was an everyday way of life to another person. And Lai's paintings explore these transgressions or thresholds. If we take a look at her work high up and above, you can see how these two figures on the left don't seem to notice that they're sort of melding into each other while their gaze is fixed upwards. You really get the sense of foreboding as the figures uncomfortably crane their necks backwards, and it's ambiguous whether the thing that they see is a welcome sight or an impending doom. But they are so entranced that their faces have been swallowed by this sort of nebulous cloud or limited pale sky that encases them in the painting. Lai's paintings conjure emotions that can help explain the feelings of anxiety or discomfort that Hong Kongers feel towards this government that encroaches upon rights that they feel are natural to them or that they are legally entitled to. This painting was created just 1 year before the outbreak of the 2019 Hong Kong protests, when citizens took to the streets to protest an extradition law that they felt threatened the autonomy that Hong Kong was promised under the one country, two systems policy, and the anxiety that Hong Kongers felt as the freedoms of speech and expression that they historically enjoyed were now threatened. Given the new Hong Kong's national security law passed on June 30th, which threatens to imprison anyone who, quote-unquote, endangers national security, this painting is eerily prescient. Lai encourages us to begin to notice the micro-invasions that populate our own lives, down to the feelings of clothes against skin or how physical structures influence how we use and orient our bodies. And this can also be a metaphor that can be extended to state control. If we begin to notice transgressions on the micro level, then you will begin to ask yourself who mandates your conditions on a national level. And under this new security law, the previous bodily memories and imaginations of Hong Kongers will be forced to adapt, just like the figures in Lai's painting can only gaze upon this limited sky. It's also important to acknowledge that, like art, this news is subjective. Some people find a patriarchal government and the policing of thoughts and boundaries as providing layers of security, while those who value free expression find this to be the deepest, most fundamental violation. As Lai's arts explore these micro-invasions that happen in the everyday, she also makes us question whether anyone was ever free in the first place. While Lai is sort of weary of the human's quickness to adapt to their surroundings, the artist Lam Tung Pang recognizes adaptability and flux as a great strength. During our conversation, Lam told me that one of the ways to truly understand Hong Kong was to stand on a street corner and just people watch, and notice the changes or adjustments that street vendors or construction workers make, putting up and taking down stalls, and the small innovations they make to get the job done. Lam is an artist who is interested in the present moment. His artwork, image-coded, currently on display at the Hong Kong Museum of Art, is a video work installed in front of the window overlooking Victoria Harbour, so the work changes as the city landscape changes. On May 28th, after the Chinese legislature approved this new national security law, Lam added raindrops to the windows, so it was like the work was crying along the city as they processed this news. Lam's practice is all about the constant revision of his prior works, where new works are remixes of prior works. Within Image Coded, there is this repeated image of charcoal being erased, which is a self-reference to his 2010 work, Selling My Soul. in which he used erasers, each stamped with a custom-made drawing of himself standing and erasing, to erase a series of paper panels covered in charcoal. In Selling My Soul, Lam expresses his anxiety over the loss of the self, but there is also this form of release or liberation in self-erasure. In erasing himself, Lam also frees himself of the artist's obligation to perform the role of the artist. As the act of erasing charcoal appears layered over the Hong Kong landscape, he extends the contemplation of self-erasure to the erasure of Hong Kong. The city is constantly changing or erasing itself, but in doing so, it also produces more possibilities. With Ferenc Lai and Lam Tung Pang, we have to acknowledge a certain neoliberal undertone attached to this focus on the individual as a sort of site of constant transgression, and this concern over the loss of personal freedom. And the work of Ma Qihang and Zheng Bo and Pak Chuen explore other perspectives. My initial research plan really did not make space to accommodate communities outside of Han Chinese origin, nor any plans that sort of took me outside the urban parts of Hong Kong. And Ma Qi and Zheng Bo really helped me realize that there are ways to study Hong Kong that don't just focus on urban life or lawmaking politics, or even humans for that matter. Hong Kong Island can be studied as a complex ecology of interspecies interactions, in which humans don't have to be at the center. They taught me to be mindful about who and what my research includes and who I exclude. Ma Qi's documentary film Ballad on the Shore, for example, attempts to document the living remnants of forgotten history. Hong Kong's fishing communities are a source of cultural heritage that many locals don't know about. The film takes place on the island of Pat Mun, a sleepy, paradise-like island in northeastern Hong Kong and Aberdeen Harbor on Hong Kong Island, and Ma follows the last surviving fishing people that knew a Hong Kong that we didn't and helped build the Hong Kong that we know today, while also exploring the ways that the city has left them behind. Artist Zheng Bo studies the relationships between plants and people. In one project titled Drawing Weed Practice, Chuen took local Hong Kongers on walks within the city, where they drew plants in silence, and this really recalls a meditative Buddhist practice in that it draws attention to life outside of the human self. This walk took participants to places like the Jamia Mosque, which is the oldest mosque in Hong Kong. While drawing the weeds that sprung up around the area, the walkers also learned about the community of Muslim squatters who lived at the mosque and how they formed their own relationship with the surrounding area and helped in its upkeep. Zheng draws parallels between the Muslim squatter community's ability to endure and thrive within pockets of the city and the plants that endure alongside them. I want to finish my talk with the work of artist Pak Chuen, whose work really explains the emotions that I felt during the research trip and helped me become a more observant scholar. Pak has a non-studio-based practice, so space isn't even an issue with his work. In freely traversing the city, he is able to capture actual instances that reflect what it's like to live and feel in Hong Kong. Pak's practice is all about finding small pockets of intimacy within the city and letting the art find him, and sort of finding these nodes of connection rather than just focusing on yourself. And if you're observant enough, there are small opportunities for intimacy and compassion and connectivity anywhere you look. So what I want to do is revisit an older work of his titled 3692 from 2003, which seems particularly pertinent today, as it was created during an epidemic and also explicates concerns of public and private security that are very relevant to Hong Kong's current political concerns. To make this work, Pak took the protective plastic sheets used to cover the face of the pin code covering door locks, which were used to prevent the spread of SARS at the time, and also recalled the protective surface coverings that we're using now during COVID. These plastic sheets bore the imprints of the fingers that previously touched or pressed them, as if these sheets hold these traces of intimacy, of skin touching skin, when interpersonal contact was not possible. But these marks also unsettling give a hint to the apartment code. So Pat calls attention to the little sights or feelings or things that connect us during times of inexplicable fear and division, and like all other artists, he provides insight into the horrors and wonders of urban living. So, in conclusion, with this hyper-awareness of conditions that we try to control and the conditions that control us, perhaps returning to the metaphor of space is actually a good way to convey some takeaway lessons. When thinking about space, we must consider what we are prioritizing when we study it. It's not just about having the physical space, but having an environment conducive to exploring ideas. It can be about taking up space for yourself, but it's also about making space for other people. And perhaps what we ought to be saying is that you can have all the space in the world, but without freedom, what's the use of it? Thank you for listening to my talk.